He's interviewed by John Podhoretz, editor of Commentary magazine. Afterwards is a weekly interview program with relevant guest hosts, interviewing top nonfiction authors about their latest work.
Jonah Goldberg, in your book, you posit that everything that we take for granted, every freedom that we have, every economic advantage that we possess as Americans and as people of the West, all of these are actually a radically new development in the history of humankind, number one, and number two, are unnatural. Right. That Western civilization as we understand it, or contemporary American Western democratic civilization, is unnatural. What do you mean by that?
Well, so first of all, great to see you, John. But
I'm just following the Brian Lamb model of just acting as though we've never met each other.
Oh yeah.
And have no preliminaries, even though we're old friends and do a podcast together and constantly exchange insults on Twitter and all of that. But
I saved your life in prison. There's that.
Well, there's that too. So, but I did want to hew to the C-SPAN model.
I appreciate that. Okay, so right. So part of what I'm trying to do in the book is get people. It's not so much just sort of say I have all the right facts. I have the perfect version of what happened in human history and all that. I'm not claiming that. I'm doing something a little different. I'm asking people just to sort of tilt their head a little bit and maybe take a step back and look at the world around them with fresh eyes, sort of alien from another planet eyes. And so a big part of my argument is just to simply say that human nature is a thing, right? It is a constant. One of my favorite definitions of conservatism is that human nature has no history. By that I mean if you take a baby from today, take a baby from New Rochelle, and you send it back 1,000 years to be raised by Vikings, it'll grow up to be a Viking, and it'll go rape and pillage the English countryside. If you take a Viking baby and you send it to New Rochelle, it's going to grow up to be an orthodontist, right? And that's because, as Hannah Arendt said, every generation Western civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children. And so the place where children are born into it first is the family, and that civilizes them into a kind of culture. And then other institutions play that role. But if you just take it as the human species, everything around the C-SPAN studios are not natural. This is not our natural environment. Our natural environment for 250 to 300,000 years was as sort of semi-hairless apes foraging for fighting for food, killing each other with spears and rocks. We weren't even apex predators until fairly recently. And if you take a jar of ants and you dump it on virgin soil on some alien planet or continent or something, the ants will instantly start behaving like ants. They'll dig tunnels, they'll set up colonies, whatever ants do. If you took humans and you cleared them of all of our civilizational education and put them in their natural environment, we wouldn't be having conversations about books or doing podcasts. We would be teaming up into little bands and troops, defending ourselves against animals and other bands and troops, because that is what our actual nature is. That's sort of the point of Lord of the Flies, right? In Lord of the Flies, you have these kids who were the pinnacle of Western civilization at the time, these kids from a British boarding school. And almost instantly, the second you put them back in a natural environment, they go all tribal, they start becoming superstitious, they carry spears, they kill each other, they attack each other. That's humanity. And so if capitalism were natural, if property rights were natural, if individual rights were natural, if democracy were natural, they would have showed up a little earlier in the evolutionary record than 300 years ago, because that's really the only time they actually show up in a sustainable way is basically in late 1600s England and then coming to America.
Right. So you say in the epilogue of the book, you make the point that for thousands of years, according to every serious economic student of human history, for thousands of years, there was effectively 0% economic growth on the planet Earth.
Right.
And that people lived on the equivalent of somewhere between $2 and $3 a day.
That's right.
Everywhere. Everywhere on the planet. Subsistence existence was what it meant to be a human being.
Right.
And there were these spurts of creativity, moments of intellectual creativity and all that, but that this was the fact.
Right. I mean, it seems so counterintuitive. Yeah. I should just say, it seems so counterintuitive to people because we have all this wonderful history about Rome and China and all the rest. Well, the rich people left cool stuff. They left words and written stuff, and the aristocrats left stuff. But they were living off of the wealth created by subsistence farmers and all of the rest, and they were a very small stratum of actual humanity.
Right. And then, as you say, around the late, in the 1700s, basically, right. If you were to draw a chart showing human progress, at least economic progress, the chart's like this. Here is like the beginning of Homo sapiens, right? It goes like this, goes like this, goes like this, goes like this, and then it goes like this. Mm-hmm. So that, as you say, 96% of people on Earth were living on $2 a day.
$2 to $3 a day.
$2 to $3 a day. And that number is 9% mm-hmm. on Earth today. Mm-hmm. So that we have 90% of humanity. And humanity, of course, is now
much bigger.
3 times, I believe 3 or 4 times, there are 3 or 4 times more people on the planet than there were in 1750. So we have this, and we think, because it's in our nature to think this, it's our parents, our grandparents, everything else, we think that this mm-hmm. is what it means to be human.
Right.
You have free speech, you have a certain level of income, even if you're poor. There's all this stuff about how the poorest person in America today, it's not clear that the richest person in America in the year 1900 would want to change places
right.
because he could get a septic infection and just die.
Right.
Whereas that is unlikely to, just from walking down the street, and that's not what life is like now. But we think that this is the natural order of things,
right.
whereas in fact this thing, this period of 300,000 years
right.
is what people really are.
Right.
And that we have built, this thing has been built to undergird our wealth, our freedoms, and it's precarious in part because it's new, mm-hmm. right? And then also it's precarious because it is a construct of ideas, and within it and against it is a construct of ideas that looks at this and says, as you do, this is unnatural. But rather than you say this is unnatural and it's amazing,
right.
and it's astounding and it's the greatest thing that's ever happened.
Right.
They go, this makes me really uncomfortable.
Right.
I don't feel like this is authentic, this is real. And you call that romanticism. Mm-hmm. You want to sort of lay out
sure.
this conflict.
Yeah, so one of the people I'm deeply indebted to is the economic historian Deirdre McCloskey. And she runs, in her books, several of them, Bourgeois Virtues, Bourgeois Dignity, she runs through all of the various theories about where what I call the miracle happened, right? And the miracle, I should start by saying, the reason why I say these things are unnatural, and the reason why the first sentence of the book is, there is no God in this book, it's not because I'm saying I'm an atheist. I'm not an atheist. It's to say that part of what I'm trying to do is actually persuade people, which is something you and I both probably agree on this. The art of persuasion is something that's kind of being lost in our political discourse these days. And so I'm trying to model best behavior by actually persuading people, trying to persuade people. And you can't say, well, we have all this great stuff, we have America because God wanted us to have it, because among other things, you can only appeal to authority when everybody agrees on the authority. And so much of what called the left or progressives or liberals, so much of their touchstones are secularism, science, evolution, these kinds of things. And if I make an argument from God, they're like, well, I don't need to listen to you. So what I'm trying to do is argue on their terms. And according to the most generous understanding of the left, what does the left care about? They care about income inequality. They care about the material condition of the poor. They care about things like tolerance and inclusivity and literacy. I mean, you just go down the list of the things that if you were having a sincere argument with a sincere liberal about the things that they really care about and say that this is why they are liberal, they would list these things. And I'm trying to make the point that all of these things get better because of liberal democratic capitalism. Not just that we get richer, we live longer, literacy goes through the roof, we're much more tolerant. And so part of my problem with the suicidal part of my analysis here is that because, first of all, we take this miracle for granted, as you were saying before. We're born into it, so we just assume this is the way the world's supposed to work, right? So we take it for granted, so then we don't defend it. But also because capitalism is unnatural, it angers our inner primitive. And if you read intellectual history going back to at least Rousseau, but even further, this complaint about capitalism and the Enlightenment and the commercial order is a constant one. It takes new forms in every generation, but it's the same. It's like one of those episodes of The Twilight Zone where a guy wakes up, and every time he wakes up, different actors are playing the same characters over and over again, right? It appears in different masks over time. And so Rousseau is largely credited for being the father of Romanticism.
So this is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Swiss-French philosopher,
right,
whose work really begins to take shape in around 1750.
Right.
And he is responding in great measure to the philosophical tradition that kind of began with Thomas Hobbes in around 1650 and then was revolutionized by John Locke.
Right. And Adam Smith.
And Adam Smith was sort of a contemporary, right, of Rousseau's. But so Locke basically lays out the idea that there are natural liberties,
right,
and that the purpose of civilization, of a civil society, is to protect the individual's rights.
Right.
This is a totally new kind of idea.
Right.
And Rousseau comes along 2 generations later to say, well, hold on a minute. That is not the purpose of society, right? The purpose, right, of society is to enrich and allow people to live authentic, natural lives, right?
So there's this famous scene that he describes himself where he's on his way to visit his friend Diderot, who's in jail, and he finds it's told in different, sometimes the translations are a little different, but he finds a flyer, an advertisement for an essay writing competition asking the question, have the arts and sciences improved morals in the state of man, or something like that. And the essay title was almost surely rhetorical, right? It was sort of like finding an essay competition at Bryn Mawr or Kenyon saying, does diversity make us stronger? Of course, you're supposed to come up with a clever way of saying yes, right? Yeah. And so this essay was about, have the arts and sciences made us better? And Rousseau looks at this, and he has basically like a Saul on the road to Damascus moment. He passes out, he wakes up drenched in his own tears, he's a bit of a drama queen, and it occurs to him all of a sudden, and this is basically the essence of his view, that we've got it entirely backwards, that, and it's very, very much sort of inspired by his Calvinist upbringing and his Christianity. He's got this sort of classic religious tale that we started in a golden age of noble savages, right, where we were rugged, where we were individuals. Totally not true, and that society has corrupted us, and that science corrupts us. And he says, man is born free, but everywhere he's in chains. And he says the first person who put up a fence protecting his property and saying this is mine was the first guy that's the original sin of mankind, is private property. Very different than Locke, right? And so Rousseau's whole orientation, and why they say he's the father of Romanticism, and I think there are other people you can call the father of Romanticism, but he certainly deserves as much as anybody else, is that his whole argument is about arguing from his own personal feelings, and to say that my feelings are more authentic than your facts, right? And that personal authenticity is the highest bar, and that emotions tell us so much more. And that's so much what early Romanticism was embracing the sort of wild side of our natures that we felt the Enlightenment was pushing away. But then he makes another leap and says that we can only be realized when everything is in perfect harmony. Sort of what I call the cult of unity, right? And so the society, everybody in society has to be working together towards the same ends. The general will rules everything. And so the contrast between Locke and Rousseau is very strong. Locke believes our rights come from God, not from government. We're citizens, not subjects. The fruits of our labor belong to us. The individual is sovereign. Rousseau believes that the group is more important than the individual, that private property is evil, and that morality can be determined by the group. But the reason I bring this up is because I actually reject this idea of doing this as intellectual history, because we don't get these ideas from Locke and Rousseau. They represent these impulses in us.
Right. So from the very beginning of the miracle, which is the term you haven't quite defined, but it is the term that describes this bizarre fact that a door, as I say in a column I wrote about the book, that something happens in the late 17th century, early 18th century, where a door is opened into human possibility and human creation. And 300 years later, we're flying to the moon. Right. We've invented a worldwide communication system. The things that we can do, the who we are, how we live, how long we live, our health, and all of that are things that would just have been unthinkably unimaginable to anybody before that door was open.
You would describe it as, it would sound like heaven on earth if you described it to somebody 500 years ago.
Right, okay. So that is the miracle starts, and the counter miracle, or the counter argument against the miracle, happens almost simultaneously, because these are the two sides of humankind.
That's right. And the differences between Locke and Rousseau, who I use as these emblems, is really a divide that runs straight through the human heart. We're all a little tribal. We all want to have this sense of belonging where we're part of a group that's more important than the individual. We all want to have we want to subscribe to things that give us meaning in ways beyond our own individuality. And we're also all Lockean. We all want to be recognized as a unique person in this universe that makes unique contributions and is free to pursue happiness as we see it. And this is an inherent tension in our hearts, and it's an inherent tension in our civilization. And so part of the suicide part is that I think Romanticism never really went away, right? This compulsion to this Rousseauian idea of saying all of this is unnatural, it doesn't feel right, we need something more authentic. And it comes up in every generation in different forms. And it can take the form of populism, it can take the form of nationalism, it can take the form of just rank irrationalism or radicalism, fascism, communism, socialism. These are all various kinds of reactionary tribalism, in the sense that they're trying to restore that sense of social solidarity that we miss. And this is the fundamental flaw of capitalism. It's inevitable, because capitalism is the greatest system ever created for peacefully improving the estate of mankind in a cooperative, nonviolent way. It just has one drawback. It doesn't feel like it. It is so unbelievably efficient at the cooperation that we don't notice the cooperation. And so one of my favorite essays, you know this as well as I do, one of the great essays in the history of libertarianism is by a guy named Leonard Read called I, Pencil. And he points out, it's written from the perspective of the pencil. And he's, I am an Everhard in favor #2 pencil, right? And there are two takeaways from the thing that every college kid should read and take away from it is, one, he says, first of all, you have all of these people, he says, my rubber comes from Indonesia, my wood comes from Canada, my tin comes from Argentina, and my zinc comes from Zinkland, wherever they got zinc. And all these people, different gods, different faiths, different languages, different customs, different heritages, working seamlessly from all around the world to produce a pencil at a fraction of a penny or whatever it costs, right? And then the second point that you should take away from it is no one knows how to make a pencil. Even pencil manufacturers don't know how to make pencils. They put together the last bits of ingredients to make the pencil. There was a guy there was an exhibit in England a few years ago called iToaster, where a guy made a toaster from scratch. And so he like mined the copper and he forged the tin and he galvanized the rubber. It took him like, I can't remember, maybe 8 years.
Yeah.
And it was a really crappy toaster. It cost a couple $1,000s, right? That's the beauty of capitalism. It gets everyone to work together. It just doesn't feel like it. And so Marx was right about this. Rousseau was right about this. They talk about alienation. That's what it is. It's capitalism is inherently alienating. And so it can only work, and this is where I go to Schumpeter, it can only work if you have institutions of civil society and the family that can provide that kind of meaning for people.
Right.
Because if they're not there, we start yearning to look for meaning in other things like politics, like tribalism, like other, because human nature always comes roaring in.
Right. So we came to call these, in the world of sort of post-war sociology, mediating institutions, right? So there's the government and there's the individual. There's the sort of massive society, there's the individual. And then if there's nothing between them, government will either inherently drive to restrict and sort of tyrannize the individual, and that mediating institutions exist to create both richness, personal richness and involvement and connection, and to prevent you from being swamped by the mass or by the tyrant. And those mediating institutions, the one which isn't even really a mediating institution because it's an institution that precedes society in some sense, is the family.
Right.
And then you have your church, your neighborhood, your union, your communal organization, your bowling league, whatever.
Friends,
right. These are the mediating institutions. Right. So the suicide of the West that you lay out has to do, a lot of it, with the weakening of these mediating institutions, partially as a result of some of the corrosive effects of capitalism, partially as the result of an ideological assault on them that is oddly from the perspective of the crazed romantic authenticity addicts, right? Who say it is these institutions that are robbing us of our authentic selves.
Right.
The family abuses us, the church abuses us, or does these terrible things to us, and all these things are so they're bad. But it turns out you attack them, and you go after them, and some pretty lousy things can start to happen.
That's right. I mean, so part of the problem is we essentially have like an autoimmune syndrome in this country where the antibodies of the body politic are attacking all of our healthy organs. And Schumpeter, I should say Joseph Schumpeter, great mid-20th century economist who predicted the end of capitalism because he predicted that the children of the industrialists and the capitalists would become intellectuals and then would become dedicated to destroying capitalism. And he turns Marx on his head, but he got it much closer than Marx did, but Schumpeter makes this point that capitalism, the relentless efficiency of capitalism is kind of like water seeking its own level. It doesn't stop at destroying just bad customs and institutions. It erodes all these customs and institutions. But I think the family could withstand the problems of capitalism pretty well. I think these institutions could withstand the problems of capitalism pretty well. The other part that comes partly from his prediction is this romantic thing, right, where the way we teach Western civilization today, the way we teach American history today, it is this concatenation of just all of the negative stuff, right? And Howard Zinn is open about this. He says, I'm going to...
Howard Zinn was the author of The People's History of the United States, which is I think most assigned now, or one of the most assigned
still
American
the most widely
textbooks.
Used history text in
and
America.
It is a deliberately ideological reading of the United States that suggests that from its very origins, the government system of the United States was more oppressive than it was liberating.
That's right, and that it was systemic persecution. He says openly.
Professor at Brown, I think, right?
I guess, yeah. He says openly, I'm writing my history from the perspective of the slaves in the Carolinas, from the women here, from the coal miners there, from the Irish there, and it's always these guys who are victimized. I have no problem with teaching that stuff, right? But here's the thing about flipping people's perspective on this. Yes, it's hugely important to talk about how we had slavery in Western civilization. But the fact is, every civilization had slavery. What's interesting about slavery in Western civilization is we got rid of it, right? Slavery is not actually natural in the sense that we've been talking about. It only comes from after the agricultural revolution, because when we lived as nomadic tribes, slaves were a heavy resource. So you killed the men and then you took the women and the children maybe, but there wasn't a lot of slavery when you couldn't put them to work. Slavery comes with the agricultural revolution. But since then, which is, 11, 12,000 years, there's been a lot of slavery everywhere. And what people don't seem to understand is that the reason why we should be horrified and why we should teach about slavery in America is because of the grotesque moral hypocrisy of it, right? We preached about all of us having being equal in the eyes of God, that all men are created equal. We didn't live up to it. And so the reason we should teach about it is because that hypocrisy illuminates the ideal. Instead, what we get today from the Zins and his heirs and from the Romantics is the very Rousseauian argument that the ideal itself was a con and oppressive and intended to enslave people, and that this idea of if there are lots of people, I think I quote some of them in the book, but there are lots of people who think it is somehow racist for conservatives to quote Martin Luther King on saying that we should judge people by the contents of their character and not the color of their skin. And so in my telling, the amazing thing about the founding wasn't that they got it perfect day one. It's that they dropped basically these mental algorithms and put them in writing, that the ineluctable logic of this idea of human equality and human dignity that is inherent in the Declaration of Independence, it took time for it to work its way through American consciousness. Lincoln at Gettysburg, he invokes it and basically rewrites the understanding of our country to be living up to those ideals. And then Martin Luther King, a century later, says the founders wrote this country a promissory note that all men, including white men and black men, are created equal and deserve to be treated with inalienable rights, blah, blah, blah. And what he was doing there was he was appealing to that ideal. He was appealing to the best self of white America, right? All the civilization is, all rhetoric is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, the best version of ourselves. And he was appealing to the best version of ourselves, and that was incredibly compelling. Today, that whole vision is sort of in tatters because there's the identity politics part of this is people are basically saying you can never get past your whiteness. All white people are racist, white privilege, white supremacy. They're demonizing white people while they're celebrating all of these other differences. And they're saying assimilation is evil. They're saying a melting pot is evil. They're saying that the essence of identity politics is that I can reduce a vast, diverse population of people to a single historical grievance based on their skin color. And that to me, one of the things I found fascinating while working on the book is trying to find all the things that if you were a visitor from Mars, you would see more continuity today than you would see change. And this identity politics bit of it is deeply human and normal, right? People say, oh, you have to be taught to hate. No. Data settled on this. You need to be taught not to hate. Right. We have an inherent distrust of strangers. Babies are born with accented cries. They almost instantly like people of their own, of the race of their own mother, right, or their own parents. And you have Paul Bloom at Yale has done amazing work about how much of this stuff comes encoded in just babies. There's a basic moral sense to them, but it's hugely wired in us as this friend versus foe, stranger versus kin thing. And so identity politics really is just another variant of the natural human tendency to form aristocracies. Because one of the greatest things the founders did, which never gets taught as a big deal anymore, is they got rid of titles of nobility, right? They got rid of the notion of a blooded aristocracy. And even though they thought aristocracy always will come back, they didn't think you should just, because of an accident of your birth, be considered better or worse than somebody else. And that's what identity politics says. It says simply by virtue of the accident of your birth, these people are more deserving or less deserving than other people. And that is deeply pernicious to the sort of the core principles that make the miracle wonderful.
Right. So the suicide then is the overlay of a set of ideas that you and I and people like us, or people I think who would read this book, the man from Mars who would come and read this book, overlay of a set of ideas that we think are destructive, overlaid on top of a system that is an extraordinary achievement. And then the question is, since it's 200, well, you could say, well, it's 250, 300 years old. That's a long time. Like, that's a lot, it's sunk roots. It's yeah, I mean, it's an amazing thing. Or you can say, it's 250 years old. I mean, as you say in the book, all of human, if you took all of humankind and said it was, all of humankind's lifespan were a year, that all human civilization or progress was in the last 14 hours on December 31st of that year.
That's right.
Okay. So it's not a lot of time.
No.
So the question is how hardy, and so my presumption is that for a lot of people who aren't the most ideological and aren't the most consumed with the romanticism and aren't preachers of the romanticism, that one of the reasons that they say, yeah, this is bad, identity politics, it's okay for people to express their pain, feel like they're part of this kind of group, and, America can take it. You can take it. You can take this criticism. Is that they don't think that it's fragile. Right. They just assume that individual liberty, they'll get to keep their stuff. There'll be a revolution, but they'll get to keep their stuff.
Fine, right.
Right. Whereas they're always in the revolution, they're always the first to go. the follow-on, the fellow traveler is always the first to face the chopping block. And so this is the really interesting aspect of the suicide question, I think, is you're saying there are these ideas, they've come up, we don't respect our history, we don't teach our history, we don't teach the glories of the miracle, we don't say that this thing that you have is something that happened because a bunch of people at a certain point in time saw something about how life could be constituted. And so the forgetting of that will lead inevitably to its disintegration.
Yeah.
Right?
So, I mean,
Or, you know what? We can take it. You know what? It'll be okay. So we're going through a bad patch now, or, we're going to come out of this and it'll all be fine. And I think we all bounce a little bit between these, depending on the day. Depending on whether there's some horror story where we go, okay, well, we're done. We're finished, Somebody beat up, Charles Murray's escort on a college campus, and you're like, okay, well, the dark ages are upon us. No one can speak freely anymore, that kind of thing. Or, you know what? I mean, look at this. This is amazing. We're about to have 3% unemployment in the United States.
Yeah. So I agree with all that, and I feel a little bit like bringing coals to Newcastle talking to you about Judaism. But there's a reason why Judaism has survived for these thousands of years. What is the official number?
3,000, I think.
Okay, so because Jews work really, really hard to keep memory alive, right? You read the Passover Haggadah, and it's thousands of years later, and we're still expressing gratitude for deliverance, right? And gratitude is part of my argument. Is that if you don't, first of all, I think conservatism is gratitude. That you look around and you see the things. These are the things I'm thankful for. These are the things I'm blessed for, and you want to conserve them, pass them on to your children, right? And I also think that a lot of liberalism, properly understood, is based in a kind of gratitude, too. It's just that kind of liberalism seems to be having trouble these days. Not to say our conservatism isn't. Yeah. And so, so I started to say this before, Deirdre McCloskey, she deals with a lot of the explanations people use for where capitalism comes from. And I think she's overwhelmingly persuasive in knocking them down. I'm less than 100% bought into her explanation, but I think it's better than almost anybody else's, which is that it was words. Just words. It was the way we talked about ourselves, the way we talked about the world around us, rhetoric, right? And for almost all of human history, certainly almost all of Western European history, innovation was considered a sin because our economics was dominated by guilds the monarchy, which took a vig off the guilds, and by the church, which also took a vig, right? And so basically, the established powers, the establishment of guild, nobility, and church, did not like any of the Ubers of Europe, right? And so innovation was actually considered a sin. It was the sin of curitas. And then for weird bottom-up reasons, this bourgeois thing starts to emerge where innovation is celebrated, where all of a sudden this Lockean idea that the fruits of your labor belong to you gets out of the bottle, and it really only happens in England. And it happened in England because England's weird, right? I mean, there have been places that have had property rights before. There have been places that have allowed innovation before. The Chinese had printing presses long before, Europe did. But time and again, the established powers shut down innovation because it was disrupting and destabilizing to the status quo. And for whatever reason, because England had a very weak central government and never had an authoritarian monarch the way, or an absolutist monarch the way France did, and never had standing armies, all sorts of reasons, this genie gets out of the bottle there. And the way we talk about ourselves changes. And so for me, a big part of the argument is just simply that if we don't talk about this stuff, we'll forget about it. That's what the Bible says. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Mm-hmm. The remember is not translated as honor. It's an activity. Mm-hmm. It's not recall. It's like these things you have to physically do, and we don't do any of that right now in our culture. And just because I want to think people like this is on your point about how recent all of this stuff is. So I write in a footnote on page 9. Think of it this way. My father was born when Oliver Wendell Holmes was on the Supreme Court. Holmes fought in the Civil War under Lincoln. Lincoln was a young man working on a farm in Indiana when John Quincy Adams was president. In 1775, John Quincy Adams, as a boy, heard the gunfire at the Siege of Boston, where George Washington commanded the colonial forces. Washington was born in 1732 at the dawn of the miracle. That's 5 lifetimes. If you want to make it 6, Washington's father was born in 1694 and died at the ripe age of 48, about 14 years past the average life expectancy for an Englishman at the time, right? So 6 lives, and even then it was just getting started. Todd Buchholz, the economist, says that for most of man's life, he lived no better on 2 legs than he did on 4. And there's another guy, I can't remember, points out that the average English citizen, in material terms, lived no better than the average Roman citizen did. I mean, the steady state of poverty was just unbelievable. And just 6 lifetimes, all of that changes. I mean, there are pubs in Oxford that I've been to that
are older than that.
They're from 1300.
Yeah. I mean, the striking thing that comes up whenever if you take, say, the 2016 election, so we move into more contemporary, which is something that you deal with toward the end of the book, and the question of what our current political situation tells us about where the West is, that we have these 2 narratives, right? We have and one of them is pretty solid. That's the Trump narrative. And then the Democratic narrative shifts and dodges around, largely because it decides to center itself on the Trump narrative and be its antithesis, right? So Trump says, America's lost. America got off track. We've done everything wrong, and there are all these people who have been left out, and I'm speaking for you. I'm your voice. You've got nothing. You haven't got raises. Your salary stinks. Your financial situation stinks, and basically, in coded terms, your cultural dominance has been taken away from you. And it's not fair, it's not right, and I'm going to take it back, right? And then you have Hillary Clinton and the Democrats who, remarkably, first time in my lifetime, or since really from the Democratic Convention on, start sort of going, this is great, this country is great.
Yeah.
This country is, I don't like to hear Donald Trump running down my country. This is terrible. This is Michelle Obama 8 years earlier that said the first time she was proud of her country.
Yeah, no, exactly.
And so now they're Merle Haggard. When you're running down my country, Hoss, you're walking on the fighting side of me.
Right.
Okay, so Trump makes this sort of tribal appeal to white America, let's say, and the Democrats become universalist, even though they are the party of identity politics. That is, everyone's proportional representation by race and gender in their political convention, and the staffing of the political convention, all that. And so Trump is maybe effectively the first really successful national identity politics politician. But it's an identity politics that the identity politics people never expected would be identity politics, which is the great danger of identity politics, which is that if the majority or the plurality decides that it is going to act as though it is an oppressed minority, well, there's no telling where that leads.
No, I think that's right. And it's amazing if you look at the polling. Everybody thinks they're oppressed right now. You can't name a demographic group that doesn't feel like they aren't oppressed or demeaned or set upon by the other people. And look, I historically, and I think you do too, I have considerable sympathy for a lot of the people in the Trump coalition who feel they're put on. I mean, the way in which our popular culture, our campus culture, consistently and relentlessly denigrates flyover people, for want of a better word, right?
Gun owners,
clinging
churchgoers,
clinging to their God and their guns, and worshiping their crazy sky god, hunters, right? And I think some of that is. I think some of those feelings of cultural resentment are legitimate in the sense that they are being put down upon. You can get away with making fun of those people in coastal elite culture that you never could for other people, right? And so but I also think, and this is something that's very controversial with the left these days, that whenever you talk about the left having some responsibility for the backlash that led to Donald Trump, they get furious. We didn't vote for this guy. This is you. This is the way the Republican Party has been going for a long time, blah, 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 blah. And there's some truth to all of that. And I've certainly been beating up the Republican Party, and you've been beating up the Republican Party. But you can't go around saying, yes, all white people are racist, right? You can't go around talking about how it's amazing how the white working class blue-collar guy, Joe Lunchbucket, was the centerpiece of the Democratic coalition from FDR up until the day before yesterday. I mean, that was what Joe Biden bragged about. That was where the votes came from, these sort of union guys.
And Archie Bunker was a Democrat. The
second they vote for Donald Trump, they're all champions of white supremacy. They're all racist. It's like, it's like the day before the 2016 election, the Electoral College, the what would they call it? The blue wall that they had, this advantage Electoral College. Democrats touted it, they celebrated it. The day it worked against them, they all of a sudden said it is a institution of white supremacy, But the point I'm really getting at is you can't demonize people forever and expect them to say, oh my gosh, you're right, I'm horrible. What people will do is they'll say, wait a second, my dad was a pretty good guy, and my grandfather fought in World War II, and my great-great-grandfather, he fought for the Union in the Civil War. And so white people did some pretty good things in this country, right? You'll get defensive. That's what normal human response, tribal response, and so now we're seeing increasing numbers of white people identifying, of saying that their core identity comes from being white, which was not the case.
Well, it's 25 years ago, 30 years ago, when Pat Buchanan's protest candidacy arose in 1992 against George H.W. Bush. And I started hearing in certain precincts of the right, I worked at the Washington Times at the time, and there were a great many people on staff who would end up working for Buchanan, ending up populating sort of early Trump stuff. And they started talking about being European Americans.
Yeah.
And this was startlingly, it was almost seemed parodic at the time. Like this is ludicrous. Like, it's one thing to say you're an American Jew, as you know, we both are. Jews make up 2% of the population of the United States. So, and it's a defining characteristic of my life. And so it's not quite enough for me to say I'm just an American, because this is a very big thing. But it's also, I do it because we're so small. That's the odd part.
And
right?
also,
but then then Europeans were an absolute majority. You can't. So they were attempting to don the mantle of an oppressed minority while being the majority, and that was a forerunner to what's happening now, where white Americans still constitute.
They're like 67% of the electorate, right?
Yeah. So they still constitute a majority, but they are not. But the idea is somehow that the only way you get standing in a society that is atomizing in this fashion is to retreat into a sub-tribe.
Yeah.
Right?
And to have a grievance, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is a huge problem. And again, I'm all for calling out the problems on our own side, but this is a problem that is a cultural problem, and the left commands the commanding heights of most of our culture, and to say that they have no role in this cultural problem, I just think is bizarre. And I'm not trying to scapegoat the left. I'm trying to persuade them in this book. And you know, I'm the house goy at NPR now. You know, and so and actually, I do want to say one thing, because I hear this from a lot of people. I heard this from Trevor Noah. I hear this from a lot of people on the left. It's funny. So, you know, in the subtitle, I've got the rebirth of how the rebirth of tribalism, populism, nationalism, and identity politics is destroying American democracy. All the liberals really agree with the populism and nationalism, and they're pretty much with me on the tribalism, and they get furious at the identity politics. And I've done a lot of conservative talk radio, and they're all with me on the identity politics, but they don't like the other stuff.
Right.
Yeah. And you're never going to get rid of ethnic politics. I got no problem with ethnic politics, right? I mean, from Ben Franklin talking about the Germans in Pennsylvania to, you know, the Irish in Tammany Hall. It's not necessarily always a good thing, right? It can go too far and all the rest. But it's very different than than the identity politics thing, which is essentially trying to create an abstraction of, you know, that I can tell all I need to know about you by some abstract, you know, adherence to something. And one of the things that makes modernity possible and so great is that we can have many different identities.
Right.
One of the things about the tribal mind is that all politics was personal in our natural environment. The tribe or the troop or the platoon, whatever you wanted to call it, was our nation, it was our family, it was our politics, it was our spirituality. We worshipped our group. The group was in relation to God. Everything, all the meaning was stacked up on each other. And one of the great things, and it has a downside because it's alienating, that comes with modernity is that instead of stacking up all the meaning, we kind of spread it out. And so at one moment you can be in church, and another moment you can be going to the movies, and another moment you can be committed to your job or your family, and we split up these sources of meaning. And that's one of the things that makes modernity possible, because it gets complicated with the role of institutional pluralism. But if you have enough buy-in in different institutions, you're willing to create this open space for other people to have different points of view, right? In the tribe, everyone's got to agree on everything.
Yeah.
And we're losing a lot of that in our politics.
Right. So Amy Chu has written a book called Political Tribes, and she posits in it that what America can be, should be, what it was at its best and what it can be again, is that the definition of being an American is that you were part of what she calls a supergroup.
Right, right.
So that your tribe can be part of the larger tribe, which tends not to be a rule of tribes, right?
Yeah.
If you're you're an Israelite, you're not a Semitic, you're not a Moabite. You actually want to kill the Moabites, but so the supergroup. But the problem here, as you talk about the spreading out of these institutions, and the idea being that because you also understand that for yours to remain healthy and free to be what it needs to be, you can't poach on the other guys that's different from you, because then you're giving them permission to come in and go at yours.
Right.
So, it's also a sort of a mutual defense agreement where, there's a DMZ, there's like cultural DMZ. You don't attack me, I don't attack you. So the question is, how do we, so your argument is that teaching our history and creating a space in which we allow our children, I mean, you and I both have teenage children, and I have younger children, so we're going through this experience of having them educated without this, that we need to give them the tools to feel the gratitude for what we have, even if they don't want to accept the ideological basis of the miracle or anything like that. But also just to say, like, get in a time machine, go back to 1600 and see how many minutes you could survive.
Yeah, no, that's right.
As opposed to living now.
And this is sort of I keep distracting myself on this, but that's the suicide part, is that what I don't think McCloskey fully appreciates is that anything that can be created by words can be destroyed by words. We can talk ourselves out of this. And we seem to be doing a pretty good job of doing this. And the reason why it's fragile is if the only thing that differentiates us from the jungle are the institutions that we're born into, and our institutions are in bad shape. And starting with the family. And so, people keep asking me, what do you do about it? What are your policy suggestions? And I don't do a lot of policy in here, but one of the things that I do say, and that I really firmly believe, is that we need to shove as much power to the most local level possible for a bunch of reasons. The first is so much of this resentment and this tribalism and all the rest comes from this sense that has its roots in capitalism, has its roots in politics, has its roots in our media. There are lots of places where this comes from. But this sense that there are people out there who are controlling my life. I have no power over my life. People are making decisions for me. People are conspiring against me. The system is rigged. We keep hearing this, right? The idea that the system is rigged. And some of that is paranoia, and it's not true. Some of it is totally legitimate. But the way you fix it is if you send as much power over people's lives to the most local level possible, you know who the powers that be are. You see them at your kid's school, you see them at the play, you see them at the baseball game, you see them at church. And so there's an accountability fix in there. You can't claim that powerful unseen forces of globalists are doing everything, right? And sometimes when people talk about globalists, they make it sound that at age 13, every globalist gets a bar mitzvah. There's some of that going on too. But you would still have culture war fights. But the advantage is the winners have to look the losers in the eye the next day. They're going to see them. They're going to be the parents of their kids' friends and all that. And that creates a certain amount of humility and a certain amount of open-heartedness to these kinds of questions. And also, people don't live in the United States of America. This is one of the reasons why nationalism doesn't do what people want it to do. People
in America.
In America, right? Americans don't live in the United States of America. They live in this neighborhood in Cleveland and this cul-de-sac in San Diego or whatever. They live in actual communities with real human beings. There's this thing, Dunbar's number, which is that there's an upper limit to the number of people a human being can actually know as human beings. It's about 150, 200 people. And that's where all of real life happens, is with other human beings. Virtual communities aren't communities. There are only like 5 things that give us happiness in life. Arthur Brooks always has a list, and I always mess it up, but it's like faith, family, friends, experiences, genes, because some people are just born miserable bastards, and this thing, earned success, which is not necessarily or even often money. It is this feeling that you made a difference in people's lives, that you're respected for making a contribution. And the government can't give you earned success. It can increase your net worth, it can't increase your self-worth. The only people who can give you a sense of earned success are the people who love you and who care about you or who respect you. And that has to be done at the ground level. And giving people more resources to find that where they actually live is, I think, really the only answer. And it has to start with the family, because, I mean, Mary Ebstratt did a wonderful piece for the Weekly Standard a while ago about how identity politics is an offshoot of the breakdown of the family, because this desire, this tribal desire to feel like you're part of something doesn't go away. And if you didn't get those feelings satisfied in your family or your local community, you go off and you look for it in abstractions. And that's what you see with a lot of these like 4chan idiots on the right, who think that they'll find meaning in their lives by calling themselves Aryans or whatever, and it's all cheap and shabby. And the way you fix it is actually by reaching out to actual human beings.
Right. So you say this. You start by saying this is a book without God. Or, you know, God is not a factor in this book. But just to conclude where we began, you nonetheless refer to this kind of seismic intellectual event 350 years ago as a miracle.
Yeah.
And as Rabbi Meir Soloveichik says in the pages of my magazine commentary this month, a miracle is a supernatural event because it's an event that otherwise naturally wouldn't happen. Right. So the word miracle is an interesting one because what it suggests, and this is also a thing with gratitude, even though this is a book that it's not atheist, but it does not bring God into it, is that what you're supposed to do with a miracle is kind of gawp at it and realize gratitude is one thing, but there's something awesome about it. A miracle is something awesome. And this simply laying out the fact of what happened to mankind over the last 250, 300 years, and to say, if these people in England, for whatever reason, had not, England and Ireland and Scotland, had not had these ideas, had this common concert of, we wouldn't, this set, as you said, wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be here. Right. I don't know where we would be. We would be in some, shtetl in Lithuania. And so there is that aspect to this, that as I read the book, and I think I read it twice, it's just a kind of awe-inspiring thing that this thing was created. It's like I went to see Chartres, the cathedral in France, which was built in the 11th, 12th century, and you walk through it, it's like the greatest building on earth. You walk through it and you're like, I can't believe they did. How did they do this? Yeah. How was this done? They didn't even have power tools. They had nothing. And that's what Suicide of the West, even though it is an extremely depressing title, obviously. No, it's fine, but made me feel we are the living witnesses to a thing that is without precedent in the life of America, of the world.
I appreciate that, and that was sort of what I was going for. So I really appreciate that. The miracle part for me, I know we have to wrap this up, but the miracle part for me isn't supposed to suggest divine intervention. It is. We also call things miracles that are inexplicable. And part of my argument is that no one intended this miracle to happen. It was an accident, and by virtue of the fact that it's an accident, and and that it was created not through human will, but through this weird convergence of contingency, we should be all the more grateful for it, because our reaction should be, oh crap, I don't want to mess this up, and have a certain amount of reverence for it. And so the story of the goose that lays the golden egg, it's always taught that it's a story of greed. It's really a story of ingratitude, because no matter what version it is, this goose is giving you this unbelievable treasure, and you ask it for more, and it says, I can't. And either out of a rage of entitlement and resentment, or out of an arrogance of intellect, they kill the goose. Where what we should be doing is building, protecting it from everybody. Back off, man. This goose is valuable. And we don't do enough of that. And that's what I'm trying to convey.
So basically, this book is building a cage around a goose.
That's exactly what it is.
And that's why everyone should read it. So,
absolutely.
No, it would take 8 years to build that cage if you didn't have 200 artisans around the world.
And I'm going to get Mexico to pay for the cage.
There we go. So.